I'm very excited today to welcome Chris Reed. Chris Reed is the principal of STOSS Landscape Urbanism. He is internationally recognized as a leading voice in the transformation of landscapes in cities, and he works alternately as a researcher, strategist, teacher, designer, and advisor. Chris is particularly interested in the relationships between ecology and landscape and infrastructure, social spaces, and cities. His work collectively includes urban revitalization initiatives, climate resilience efforts in Boston, Dallas, Abu Dhabi, China, and throughout the Midwest, speculative propositions, adaptations of infrastructure in former industrial sites, dynamic and productive landscapes, vibrant public spaces that create a diversity of social uses and cultural traditions, and numerous landscape installations.
Amy, there's a lot of HVAC noise, we can hardly hear you.
Extra loud. Should I do the microphone?
Yes.
Okay. Sound good?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Chris is the co-editor of Projective Ecologies and co-author of Mise en Scène, The Lives and Afterlives of Urban Landscapes with photographer Mike Bellamy, an immersive exploration of the social lives of urban landscapes. He is a recipient of the 2012 Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award in Landscape Architecture, a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the 2017 Mercedes T. Bass Landscape Architect in Residence at the American Academy in Rome. Chris received a Master in Landscape Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania and an AB in Urban Studies from Harvard College. He is currently Professor of Practice in Landscape Architecture and the co-director of the Master of Landscape Architecture in Urban Design program at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. So let's give Chris a warm OU welcome.
All right, thanks. Can you hear me? Does that work good? Yes. All right. Thanks, Amy. Thanks to Amy and the committee for inviting me, to the school, the faculty, and the dean for hosting me. I've never really been to Oklahoma before, so like I'm on hour, 20 at this point, but thoroughly enjoying the visit. Wish I was supposed to be here for longer, but between government shutdowns and airplanes that don't work, it took me a lot longer to get here than I had imagined. So glad you could join. I'm gonna give a talk where I'm trying to put together some of the pieces of the work we do and some of the agendas that we have within a particular kind of framing. So just know it's a work in progress. And in fact, I've taken a former lecture and completely flipped it around. So if I get confused in the middle of it, it's because I've lost my way. So just know that in the same way that you guys are put on the spot to try to think through things, we're continuously doing this at the practice as well. The other thing I want to say is, there's a lot going on in the world today, right? There sometimes it can seem overwhelming, the things that we're asked to do in our lives and with our practices and with our work. And so in some ways, what I'm trying to do with this talk is figure out what is the efficacy that we have as designers? Where can we start to address some of the issues that we see? But how is it that we do so through design, really looking at the heart of the discipline and us as designers? How is it that we can really find our strong point in working through design to try to touch on some of those things that may be important to you? And so that's one of the things that I'm talking through and wrestling with in the talk. So in that sense, I want to frame the talk around the simple question of who and what do we design for? Design publics is this framing, which obviously involves people or the public, but it's deliberately pluralized to recognize the many and diverse publics that we deal with in the practice. But more broadly, public can also refer to the places and people holding common interests or characteristics more generally. Like the question of the civic, this speaks to questions of what's open and shared between and among us, perhaps in the service of the community or in service of the general welfare. and it begs certain questions. What's the nature of the publics that design can inform, or serve? And how might we think of or conceptualize what design is in service of multiple publics? And here we're beginning to think about people, multiple histories, multiplicity, environment, climate, and any number of issues that we want to take on. And so I want to talk about this idea within the context of what's generally perceived to be a bifurcated understanding of design. Either we take on design with a capital D, that includes the larger cultural projects of architecture, art, and design that aspires to new ideas, to academic discourse, and to the emergence of new ways of thinking and making, new forms and formations. And maybe distinguish that between what's come to be known as community-based design, or citizen design, or design in concert with communities and people. This is design developed with people living and working in neighborhoods and cities, sometimes underserved, underrepresented, but where we're dealing with the basic needs and desires within a community, how a process like that might build community and might be done for the public good. Now, for me, design publics brings these agendas together. It posits that what matters most generally to society and to the world today, whether it's environment, climate, social and racial issues, even economic issues, these issues can positively inform and motivate the bigger design project. But that highly creative, ideas-driven, and cutting-edge design can embed these agendas and prompt new conceptual frameworks, both for the advancement of the discipline and for the advancement of the world at large. And so with that kind of general overview, I want to just get into a little bit some of the questions that we're being asked to deal with in the practice today. There are many urgent issues to confront, climate being one of them. Whether you think of sea level rise, storms, hurricanes, the increasing intensity and frequency of hurricanes and storms and rain events, whether you think about flooding from oceans, flooding from rivers. The image on the right is from my hometown, Boston. This is a regular high tide that occurs now once a month or every couple months, where the lower docks in the downtown are flooded, right? People deal with flooding of various kinds in many different ways. And yet in other places across the country, around the world, there's just the opposite. There's not enough water, there's drought, there's heat, urban and otherwise, rising temperatures, right? Loss of biodiversity, increasing wildfires, intensities of wildfires. We saw that most notably in Los Angeles earlier this year. But with this comes biodiversity loss and a loss of ecosystem functioning, and frankly, a loss of habitat for some of the creatures that are out there. We have rising temperatures. Those temperatures tend to be already higher within cities, and that's just increasing. And then we have disproportionate effects, right? Urban dwellers have less access to places that they can go to get to cooler places. They oftentimes, there are public health issues, limitations about access to open space, et cetera, et cetera. So we're dealing with a lot of issues at the same time. And yet, I also want to posit those issues against basic needs for sociability, right? And social interaction in public space, right? The way in which we can think about programming and just hanging out with other people, right? Finding joy in places. This is about social interaction and about personal and collective well-being. But also, we need to think about a backdrop of social, racial, ethnic deliberations and debates that are happening right now. Whose stories are told when we're working with people? Which stories are told? How do we commemorate? How do we remember? How is this manifest in the work? Or simply, how do we hold space in the work for diverse and different worldviews? And I think at the biggest scale, we begin to think about how we design with and for an expanded range of publics that go beyond the human, right? Including those things like climate, environment, wildlife, et cetera, that are simply beyond us and yet somehow held in common. In this way, we can think of folks like Donna Haraway and her writings on kinship, for instance. She talks about this ongoing multi-species story and practices of becoming with, right, in times that are precarious and perilous. and yet she says we're at stake to one another. She's really begging for finding commonality and common ground. And so the question here is, how can embracing expanded voices and engaging broader dynamics and issues positively inform the design processes that we're dealing with, design thinking, and the bigger project of city making in ways that render them and us more empathetic, more generous, and perhaps more civic in purpose. And so there are many avenues for how these ideas are manifest in our work. I'm going to trace a couple threads for you, starting squarely with ecology and environmental issues and how we begin to think about climate as part of the expanded range of publics, something that's simply shared across local and global cultures. I want to expand that to both the human and the non-human. Actually, we'll show you some work from school that I've done with students on wildlife connectivity within the context of the city. And then second, a second set of threads that talk about the social, accommodating difference and flexibility, and looking at things, anything from the scale of a bench, the design of a bench, to the design of an entire city. So with that, we'll dive right in. We'll start on this first set of threads that are environmental. We can think about this as a project that looks to reinstigate or reinaugurate ecological dynamics in places. The science of ecology tells us that the world is always in a state of interaction, of dynamic interrelationships between organisms and the broader environment, and by extension between and among humans and non-humans, environmental processes and the material stuff of the earth. This is different ecology than I learned when I was growing up and studying. We studied ecology as wanting to achieve a steady state, right? But we now understand ecology is always in a state of motion, always trying to adapt to changing conditions over time. So the question here is, how do we activate the latencies of a place, the dynamics that are inherent in a place, in search of new integrated relationships and new dynamic futures? How do we think of the environment as part of our expanded public, our shared place on Earth? And we start here with smaller experiments in reinaugurating dynamics, interactive or at least responsive technologies sometimes, and across multiple scales. A very simple installation at Radcliffe College. We were given exactly 3 days to design and execute a project, which has never happened before. And I got to say, at that point, I said, the only thing we can do is dump a bunch of dirt here. And so we went out and found, I think, about 10 dump trucks filled with different kinds of materials that are commonly used in the landscape, piled them up in cones, and let them sit there over time to see how they might erode in relationship to rain, wind, other processes that were happening, squirrels that were moving across them, occasionally a drunk student or two that would get lost wandering through these things, right? The whole idea was to measure the material change relative to the environmental conditions that these things were encountering. And it was a nice little experiment. But we've experimented with these kinds of dynamics in the public realm as well. This is Erie Street Plaza in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a public garden project right at the edge of an industrial port, former confluence of 3 rivers with some really stunning marshes that have been erased. But the project is for a public garden that redirects stormwater falling onto the site and occasional projected river flooding in order to reinstigate certain kinds of riverine ecologies that have been once displaced by infrastructure and industry, thus reclaiming space for water and ecology in the city. So we're designing a space to capture water, to begin to replant some of those same materials that have been displaced, to reinaugurate some of those same hydrologic and ecological dynamics that were once found here. And what that resulted in is this really beautiful marsh that sort of changes quite dramatically over the course of the year, right? So there's a rhythm to this, there's a cycle to this. It kind of sleeps in the winter and then comes back to life in the spring again. So how do we begin to infuse public spaces with these sorts of sensibilities and these kinds of dynamics? At Gierstacker Grove in the heart of Michigan's North Campus, a project whose mandate to capture and infiltrate 95% of the stormwater falling on site was transformed into a project where we began to think about the relationships between environment, technology, and experience on the site. Here, the project was complicated because we had clay soils. We couldn't just simply infiltrate water. We had to hold water for long periods of time. And so you can see 5 very large stormwater gardens scattered around the site that were there to hold the water. But into this, we injected not only plants that could deal with cleansing that water, but an interactive lighting installation here. And so the lighting glowed, but as more water entered the system, the more it rained, the more these lights flickered. So the more miserable it was outside, the more beautiful the effect of the lighting was. And the idea was to create some kind of experience within that environment that would connect people to the everyday lives of what that environment was through this very subtle technology. So there you see the light rods, there you see them glowing at night. And it was yet another experiment just to see how is it that we can bring sustainability and environment to life. A couple larger projects that take on these issues. Actually, I'm skipping one here. Oops. Third project that deals less with water, but more with urban forestry. So this is a 1-acre site in the heart of Cambridge, where we were asked to design an urban forestry demonstration project. It's a project that revitalizes one of a series of leftover and underutilized spaces in a part of the city with limited access to open space, a low percentage of tree canopy, and an intense urban heat island effect. The idea here was to overplant with a lot of plants initially, allow those plants to outcompete one another like they would in the forest, and then allow for culling over time so that the species that were most well adapted to those particular conditions and sites remained, right? And so this is a very interactive management kind of process, right? It's usually one that cities don't want to take on. But the idea was to find a way not to pre-select what we thought would be the strongest species relative to what those changing conditions were, but allow the trees themselves to tell us over time. You can begin to see, this is a great video that Climate Central did. They did a whole feature on how to cool urban spaces. And this is one of the projects they featured. They flew some drones, I think illegally, in areas that had a lot of helicopters moving around, but caught some great footage of this. So this was a site, you can see there's been a lot of redevelopment in this area, but there wasn't a whole lot of open space. And the idea that we're now taking what was a abandoned site, traffic island, former petroleum site, and turning it into a kind of nest of biodiversity in the middle of the city as an experiment is kind of the unique piece here. We use bare root trees, so we planted over 400 individual trees on 1 acre of land. The idea that those bare root trees would begin to grow quite quickly and outcompete one another. We planted 25 new tree species. Here you can see some of the small guys. You can see we retained a few trees that already existed on site, put in some younger to middle-aged trees as well, so that there was a full range of trees. But there are a couple sequences here where you can see the trees at 1 year and the trees at 3 year. You can see how they're starting to thicken up here and really creating a level of density here. Each of the edges of this triangle has quite a different edge condition, a different level of porosity based on what was going on outside the site and where people were moving to and through to invite them in. We did want to invite people in. We did want to offer a space for the community, and we wanted, importantly, to signal that just because we're doing a project about urban forestry, that we wanted it to be crystal clear that people were welcome here. We wanted people to be able to experience this, right? Both in terms of people who just love sitting in trees and seeing foliage, but also folks who could really use the respite in terms of shade, in terms of the quality of air and light. And you can see the wind here moving through the trees quite nicely. And so it's a project where we're really thinking about ways to inaugurate a new set of ecological dynamics through urban forestry, implant too many trees to see how an adaptive process over time might yield a healthier and stronger and more adaptive space, both for people and for the environment as we go forward. So those are all projects that are really quite small, quite tight. We're now having the opportunity to take some of those ideas and scale them up. One of the biggest projects we've had in the office for a number of years is Moakley Park on the harbor front in Boston. It's a missing link in Olmsted's Emerald Necklace. This is a partial plan of the Emerald Necklace. If from the big park in the bottom left, you had another chain that extended to the water, our park would be at the end of that piece of the linkage. This is the park as it exists today. It's one of Boston's largest waterfront open spaces, but it's largely a single-use recreational facility. And the idea is to transform it into a resilient and multifunctional 21st century community park. It's both beloved by the people who utilize it. There are a lot of rugby clubs that use it, some baseball teams, and a few others. But it's also highly underutilized and problematic. It's slowly sinking into the ground. It's also an entry path for sea level rise and coastal inundation. So you can see the arrows that come right through the site. Not only will the park be flooded, but adjacent neighborhoods will be flooded and some critical infrastructure will be flooded. And so the city has looked at this as part of their coastal resilience system. How is it that we redesign a park to accommodate the climate challenges that we're facing, both in terms of flooding, but also in terms of urban heat and loss of biodiversity, and how do we transform that into a great community park and a great destination park for many. And yet coastal flooding is not the only issue. It's not currently handling the inundation that comes with more intense and frequent rainstorms as well. So even though there may be 12 ball fields that are out there right now, more than half of them are typically not usable because of the flooding that happens. And partly that's because of more rain coming, and partly that's because of a rising groundwater table, and partly it's because the earth is settling into the ground. Why? This was a former mudflat and salt marsh that was filled over time, right? So the fact that we've put, it was a garbage dump at one point in time, the fact that we've loaded a lot of debris onto soft, squishy, mushy land, it's no surprise that it's slowly sinking into the earth, right? But we've got this kind of problem of land sinking, groundwater rising, sea level rising and wanting to come in, right? And how to begin to deal with elevations and all the technical complexities. Never mind, we have a 100-year-old infrastructure underneath the park as well. It's also got a, I'd say rich and sometimes controversial social history as well. It's across the street from one of the first public housing projects in the whole US that's currently being renovated. It's been a place of contestation. In the 70s, there were a lot of racial issues in Boston, and so it has been one of those places where some of those confrontations flared, and we're very well aware of that. But now we're thinking about, okay, with all of this in the background, how do we build a kind of strong community park that's really rooted in the diversity of community people that are there, but also are taking on some of these bigger challenges. And so on the one hand, it's addressing a whole lot of issues from connectivity to stormwater, to seawater, to programming. It's looking at issues that are addressing very basic needs for people who live across the street, but also creating destination opportunities for people to come from all parts of the city. The coastal park is probably one of the most unique features. So the piece of the project that's closest to the water, we're essentially embedding a flood wall and a flood berm along this gray line. You'll never see it. It's going to be hidden within the landscape. But then we're creating this incredible coastal park that'll allow for flooding to happen, right? It'll also allow for the development of habitat that doesn't currently exist in the city, that's very much in tune with the coastal habitats of New England. So we're really beginning to develop this as a way to think about bringing the kind of ecology of sites outside the city and bringing them right into the heart of the city. The water piece of it is very important. So we're thinking about how the coastal landscape can absorb rainwater on the one hand, and you begin to see some of the ponds and pools start to fill temporarily. But also during those bigger storms, the entire area will flood. The flood berm is at the back edge of this. And then over time, as the storms recede, that water will slowly infiltrate and will slowly go back to the ocean. And so the idea, this is kind of an on-the-ground view of what that might look like one day. This is a study model that we've been doing. So we're beginning to test this hydrologically, we're testing it physically, we're testing it in terms of the sensorial nature of it. But the idea is to have this flexible, adaptive space that on the one hand functions as a piece of climate infrastructure, but on the other hand can host different kinds of activities day in, day out. And I think I was showing this to some of the landscape architects today. We're at the point of really further developing that waterfront amphitheater, that floodable amphitheater, and are looking at different study models and different configurations for how we think about a flexible space that could host a big performance, but is really great for the everyday, has an interactive water fountain, but also a place for hosting different kind of events and festivals along the waterfront. The park also includes a heavily programmed city edge with some of those activities that are really accessible to people who are living immediately across the street. These are actually organized by age group. So teenagers have basketball courts, there are places for little kids, there are places for elders, all connected with a series of pathways and promenades and trees and sitting areas. But all of those things immediately across the street from where people are. And of course, there are all sorts of stormwater systems embedded into those as well. And then the heart of the park is really sports and recreation and play, which is what the kind of most recent history of the park has also been about. So it's a complicated site, but it's a project that attempts to integrate the environmental, the social, and the infrastructural. It certainly leans into the dynamics of coastal flooding and stormwater, but we're trying to layer it with all these other pieces to make it a vibrant urban destination as well. And finally, I want to extend the environmental piece in our sense of the public to the broader scale of environment and wildlife, the non-human, the multivariate species that inhabit the earth. How do you design from the standpoint of wildlife first, temporarily displacing the human? And what might that reveal about us? This is work really that I've developed in conjunction with Nina Marie Lister, who's an ecologist and planner. We've done some work together at school, teaching seminars and design studios. And it's also derived from notions of the wild, both some of the things Donna Haraway was talking about, her notions of kinship, but also Jennifer Walsh's writings about animal geographies as a way to link us to that which is both beyond and simultaneously all around us. I think in many ways this is an essential component of our shared and general welfare on the planet, and I think these are really experiments that dive in to that. And these ideas are manifest in work with both indigenous communities and wildlife experts on a series of riverfront projects in Edmonton, Alberta. So this is from the practice, really looking at a river corridor that in many ways is still wild, but highly impacted by urbanization. And I think the project here started with the idea of working around and reestablishing wildlife corridors along the river corridor, as well as creating new habitats along this urbanized river front. And so here we were constantly thinking about where the animals needed to go first and how to design pathways and accommodations for people second in relation to that, in ways that would create really beautiful and dynamic experiences for people as well. So you can see these pathways lift up off the ground so that we're not blocking some of those movement corridors. And then in some places, we're actually unburying streams to create important riverine habitat that no longer exists, right? But it's a project that starts with the viewpoint of wildlife and then builds a project for people around it. The work with Nina Marie at Harvard is Wild Ways. So this is a series of design studios that imagine new relationships, new existences, new urbanisms even, that are built around human, non-human kinships, in part by displacing the human perspective momentarily in favor of the species lens and the species needs. How do we leverage this shift in perspective from human to non-human in order to imagine new kinds of urban and environmental projects built around wildlife connectivity and habitat, and around human-wildlife interactions. So one of the first things we do with this is give each student a particular species of animal that they then need to research, right? And one of the things we're interested in, what are the food webs and food chains that these species are involved in? What are their habitat needs? And what are some of the threats to the environment that those species take? But one of the most interesting drawings we ask them to make is do a drawing from the lens of the species, right? What does the species see or sense within the world around them? And how do we begin with an understanding from that perspective to begin to build around? So this is a drawing of the mountain lion, the way the mountain lion sees and hears at night, right? Always at night. And some of the animals that the mountain lion is looking at. This is I think it's the red-legged frog with the big bulging eyeballs, right? And not only do they bulge and you get this kind of panoramic view, but they're also kind of, don't look at this too long, you might get dizzy, but that's what happens with them. And there's something weird about the way that they're seeing and sensing the world. We've looked at trout. We've looked at the tarantula, the desert tarantula, which does not see at all. In fact, it senses vibrations in the world, right? So how do you begin to draw that? How do you begin to sense that? And how do you do it at the scale of that species, right? Suddenly the tarantula is the biggest thing in the room, and yet it's this tiny little creature, right, within the desert. And so we asked them to draw what are the habitats, what are the habitat needs, almost beginning to think about, like, these are the design parameters for how to begin to think about designing habitat and landscape for these creatures. Some of them are smaller than your fingernail. This is particular, the La Segunda blue butterfly, right? And then how do you begin to develop a whole project around that? So one example is the California condor. This is a pretty talented team looking at the different habitats, the different behaviors. Condors are very graceful creatures, but they're lazy. They don't actually flap their wings to fly. They float gracefully on wind currents, right? And so they have to have the right set of wind currents to begin to interact in the environment. But they're threatened by a whole bunch of things like power lines and lead from bullets. They don't kill their own prey. They allow other people and other creatures to kill prey that they feed on. So there are a whole series of threats that have really shrunk their habitat over time. And so this pair of students began to investigate how to design with wind, right? How to begin to think, this isn't a creature that's walking across the ground, it's a creature that can fly great distances, but needs to do so using air currents. So they began by thinking through what are the various ways we can think about wind and designing with the wind, and then developing a series of habitat nests across the city, in this case Los Angeles, that could become moments for developing habitat and rest. So they're taking things like old landfills, for instance, and converting those into places for habitat. There are places in the middle. You can see the orange thing in the middle is actually roadkill that the DPW brings in to offer food. And humans are kept at a distance here, right? Humans are part of that environment, but they're kept at a distance so that the habitat, first and foremost, is developed around that species. But it's also a project where they were suggesting moments where you densify the city in order to further intensify some of the wind flows. So they found a couple places, a couple gaps within that environment where if you could grow denser, higher cities, you can begin to funnel air in certain ways that would allow the birds to move. And so who knows if the science is 100% on that, but the idea that you're designing a city around the connectivity needs of a particular animal is pretty fascinating. In other instances, they were looking at things like very small animals, the desert tortoise and the tarantula here, and really looking at the ground in the desert and looking at things that they could do 1 foot above the ground, 1 foot below the ground in order to better develop connected habitat and connectivity for these creatures as well. So they're thinking about habitat in relationship with wind power sites and solar power sites, which are oddly exclusionary to native wildlife in those areas. Designing an inverse curb so that creatures this small can't actually get up onto the road so that they're squished. These curbs actually funnel them to connections that go underneath the highway. And really a fascinating project that always works at that kind of micro scale, if you will, within the desert. A third project that looks at the highway manual for Caltrans and begins to think if there are typical ways of building bridges and conduits and those sorts of things, how do we modify those standard details in order to promote wildlife connectivity in conjunction with infrastructure? So rather than thinking about one big wildlife bridge that might cost $60 or $80 million, how is it that every single bridge and culvert at a small scale can include a little budget and some modification in order to allow for connectivity here. And then the last project that's really looking at fires and owl habitat outside of Yosemite Park, and is beginning to think through the ways in which the owl can be memorialized. Owls don't like people, so the more people there, the more that they're gonna go away, right? And yet their habitat's being devastated by wildfire. So a couple totems to owls. The one in the upper right's interesting. It's an owl nest, but the owl will never be there when the people are there, and vice versa, right? So there's always this dual use. But the most interesting one is the one on the left, where layers of this structure will burn away in the event of a wildfire, but it's impregnated with certain kinds of seed. So the seed will be released gradually as layers are being worn away, so that instantly the site of the wildfire becomes a regenerative site, and that habitat is recovered really quite quickly, right? So really finding ways to think differently about design by just adjusting where your starting point is. And so with all of these are projects that imagine coexistence at the very least, sometimes entwined, empathetic, and enriched relationships at their best. All right, the second part of the talk is really where we talk about the social and the idea of how to accommodate difference. This is where, as much as when I started the firm, I really wanted to talk about landscape as an urbanism project, and I found myself designing benches, right? And we became bench designers. Every project now has its own kind of seating arrangement. But it's really about accommodating difference. It's about flexibility and adaptability within the public realm. It's born from an interest in human behavior, recognizing the difference in human bodies, in our moods, in our different desires for setting and context and degree of sociability. It's also recognizing our innate tendency to reappropriate the world in front of us, to encounter it as sentient, curious creatures, and to simply explore and use it as it comes to us. This is a sense of just people doing the things they do, sometimes in very unexpected places. We adapt to the conditions around us and put them to unintended use to suit our purposes. This is what's happening in Herman Hertzberger's photos of two ladies on the right, lunching in front of a cafe, sandwiched between two parking cars, right? They could have eaten in the cafe, they could have eaten on a sidewalk table, and they chose to squeeze themselves into that place, right? It's also what the people on the left are doing. They're improvising within the environment that they're inhabiting and finding a way to adapt to that and find sociability and fun. With this, the idea of choice, diversity, flexibility, and adaptability of designed elements and spaces and of the people who will come to inhabit them are critical informants for a place to be conducive to a richly changing social and collective use. And so with this project at Harvard University, we really start with the scale of the human body and the design of a bench. And in doing so, we're not thinking about the one typical bench profile designed to one kind of body, right? Like the chairs you're sitting in. We're actually thinking about different body types and different scales and different positions for people to be in. And in some ways, we're then thinking about the different sectional cuts through a seating device, right? That we can begin to put together and then script together using software to begin to allow one bench to do many, many, many different things and to host people in a variety of different ways. And so with this, you have the ability for people to sit alone, to sit in groups, sit with somebody in their lap, to slouch, to lean back, to lie down, right? All within the context of a single bench or a single cluster of benches as they're doing here. It also allows in some conditions for a little kid to be eye level with their mom, right? To be able to have a face-to-face interaction. These same ideas of flexible use and flexible space are extended then to the environment at large. How do we begin to think about the environment around? How do we begin to program a very flexible social space that can accommodate any number of different activities, right? From small to large, art fairs, crafts fairs, food trucks, and the like. And so the design of spaces that are intentionally allowed to be flexible, but are programmed that embed a series of infrastructures to them, in this case, foundations for tents, utility hookups that allow for a kind of plug-and-play surface and for any number of activities to begin to carry themselves out across the course of a day or over the course of many seasons. This kind of flexibility is what allows for a really lively public space, right? That it can be encountered and used in many different ways by many different people over time. And so this one's quite heavily programmed in different ways, spring, summer, and fall, and even into the winter as well. These same sorts of experiments we've done at multiple scales. So I said we were a bench designer early on. These were the bench modules at Erie Plaza in Milwaukee that I showed you earlier. The idea here is that these parts could be assembled in multiple configurations. They double as lighting, but then you can sort of find your own place. You can be in the shade, in the sun. You can be in conversation with others or alone out on your own. But the idea was, how do you develop a number of pieces to be reconfigured and to be appropriated in any number of ways? At Michigan, this takes on additional function. These elements retain grade, they direct stormwater, and they're really born from a kit of parts that can be assembled and reassembled in multiple long configurations like this, all from a set of pre-standardized pieces. And so we're quite fascinated with this idea of creating these pieces, allowing for flexibility, variability, over time, creating something that's really quite customized, right, but allows for social use and for design expression in many ways. At the City Deck in Green Bay, these things are scaled up to the civic and the performative, to the scale of infrastructure and the scale of the river. So the folding here of wood surfaces to accommodate the human body in one instance, but also to accommodate collective gathering and gathering at the edge of the river, right? So there's a scalar thing happening here using just one surface, one material, that allows for different levels of interaction, different positions relative to the river, different relationships to play themselves out over time. And in a place like this, also allow for and accommodate river flooding, as well as the everyday and the unanticipated, the unexpected, things that are simply beyond our control. Most recently, we opened a project at Brown. This is a project in a historic setting, need for new kinds of flexible program and activity in a historic quad. It's a combination of formal and informal uses set within this quadrangle. The desire for both performance here, for a place for students to hang out, and for improved accessibility across campus, all carefully inscribed into this hillside. So the existing condition had two sets of stairs, one on either side of the quad, that made the whole quad inaccessible, but this whole precinct on campus inaccessible as well. So for the architects that I was just with, and we were thinking about accessibility, this is one where accessibility became the backbone of the project. This extended straight path on one side and the curving path on the other side allowed us to then nestle in this amphitheater to the slopeside condition. And then the slopeside condition allows for a variety of different kinds of performances and activities to take place, whether it's a kind of dance or music performance there, or a kind of, this is a spring fair layout, or any kind of tented events as well. The idea that we're creating better accessibility, but also a little bit of flexibility as well, by just inscribing these stone seating elements into the hillside is really what we're getting at. These photographs are just off my camera from the opening last week. Materially, we're quite interested in how this fits within the historic landscape, and yet some of the detailing is very much contemporary as well. But it's offering a new way for students to begin to utilize the quad for sitting or hanging out, just studying in the sun, for interacting with one another, or for staging performances or events. Turns out it's also become one of the gathering spaces for student tours that are operating on campus, prospective student tours. And so they've adopted it quite quickly. I think as you scale up to cities, we're doing a lot of work with cities now. Things get a little bit more complicated when you talk about all the social issues that are happening, questions of identity and race and historic disinvestment in communities. And by extension, how do we recognize and commemorate some of the things that people are always doing? In Detroit, we were fascinated by the kind of back to the earth, back to the landscape movement that we saw there. We saw that with art, we saw that with urban cultivation projects, right? And in some ways, the work tried to formalize those as accepted uses. Uses in landscapes that were built around food and cultivation became really important, built around art and community. And a lot of the work that we were doing was imagining new forms of urbanism that were really landscape-based and took advantage of the extensive vacant lots that were available to us. But as importantly, it was really grounded in some of the social initiatives that were happening on the ground at the time. This kind of work extended into work we did in St. Louis for the Brickline Greenway project that tried to connect multiple neighborhoods across the city along a 20-mile greenway. This is a city that in some ways has been developed in parallel worlds, parallel cities, if you will. And the idea was to connect those places, to connect those people, and to bring to light some of the hidden, buried, and interests and histories of a place, and make those palpable, make those part of the itinerary of the place. So how do we take a buried river corridor and bring it back to life, for instance? How do we take cultural places of cultural importance to different people across the city and make that the backbone of how we choreograph routes and tell the stories of people in those places? And so part of it's a piece of infrastructure that's really connecting all these disparate parts of the city for the first time. But part of it's celebrating some of the things that are, nationally and world famous about what that city's about. And some of it's excavating places underneath highways and finding new ways to program and utilize those spaces and bring people together in different and new ways. And part of it's finding cultural gems like the Museum of Black History and beginning to build a new legacy of open space and investment and interaction around those places as well. And so with projects like this, how do we allow for flexibility? How do we invite the public in to begin to be part of the process? And how do we begin to imagine new and multiple futures for a particular place? Again, in a place like this, working with community on a toolkit of parts that could be installed in different ways over time according to their own priorities and according to the ways in which they want to invest time and money and resources in a place. There's a project here that I think I'm going to finish on in Dallas, Texas, that I was particularly asked to talk about. This is the site of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and it's a project called Living History, Space for Reckoning. It's a rumination on questions of commemoration, of remembrance, and of the role of public space. It's a collaboration between STOSS, my firm, Monica Ponce de Leon of MPDL Studio, and the architecture critic Mark Lamster, who instigated the question of what to do with the current state of Dealey Plaza and Martyrs Park in Dallas, two spaces of commemoration that are heavily and negatively impacted by vehicular and rail infrastructure and intense traffic. In developing the work, we wanted to bring to light those stories, those multiple stories that lie buried just beneath the surface of our cities, of our cultures, of our society, in ways that allow us to confront the multiple, the harder, and the sometimes brutal realities of our entangled past. It's a project that poses a number of questions. How do we ensure that public spaces tell the complex and interconnected histories that have shaped our culture and inform who we are? How is it that we might transform the recognition and commemoration of moments of civic, political, and racial violence in ways that allow us to reckon with these histories and to set a foundation for conversation and for healing? How do we animate the people that embodied and lived our complex histories in ways that are honorific and continue to live on? And how do we forego a focus on the single person or the single moment, on grand gestures or static moments, in favor of recording and tracing the multiple lives and histories and ecologies that have taken place on a site whose stories continue to unfold? Those are my collaborators. I don't know what Monica's doing there. She hasn't none of us have figured that out. That's Mark Lamster, who I took the unusual role of instigating a project in advance, right? Rather than commenting on a project that somebody else did. All of this requires a new way of thinking about commemoration in public space, rather than focusing on the single person or the single moment in time. Public space has the capacity to record and trace the multiple lives and histories that have taken place and continue to take place in an unfolding series of stories. Public space should offer opportunities for interaction on people's own terms, a space for reflection and contemplation and reckoning, a place for discourse, for debate, for gathering, for remembrance, and even just for the simple and ordinary pleasures of everyday life. In public space, history can be broadened and deepened, can be enlivened and honored, and can be written anew as part of the evolving life of a city. The proposed reimagining of Martyrs Park in Dealey Plaza weaves a reconsideration of the site of the assassination of President Kennedy with a reframing and enhancement of the proposed Martyrs Park, site of the lynching of 3 innocent black men, Patrick Jennings, Cato Miller, and Samuel Smith. In concert with the nearby Holocaust Museum and the city's judicial complex on the riverfront, these places highlight moments of intense racial and political violence in the city while honoring and celebrating the lives lost. The project features 2 key memorial elements: the Dealey Plaza Memorial Overlook and Amphitheater, and a connector to Martyrs Park. The Overlook and Amphitheater, which you see here, offers a space for reflection, for orientation, just behind and overlooking the place that President Kennedy was assassinated. The wood deck rises up over the rail lines and over the triple underpass to create a space, on the one hand, for a gathering in the middle, and also to take in a space that takes in views toward Dealey Plaza. You're looking at some of the design inspiration for the structure and nature of the deck itself, but the deck hovers above the rail lines. These are models we just produced for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. On the right hand, smaller gathering spaces for classrooms, and then on the left was a model of this space. So for the first time, you're able to look over the site that Kennedy was shot, which is on that piece of roadway, to see the building behind the trees that he was shot from. And then to get up and turn around and see the Martyrs Park on the other side of the roadway. The idea then would be that you can wander back down the ramp behind and into the space. So further connecting these 2 spaces. And again, accessibility was really important here, but the need to create a continuous 5% ramp allowed us these very generous, graceful, arcing pathways that allowed us to both walk around the site and descend gently into the site as well. The site also contains this memorial by artist Shane Alberton and Norman Lee with poet Tim Seibles that commemorates the lynchings in Dallas. And it commemorates generally a set of lynchings that happened over the course of many decades, but also the 3 particular black men that were lynched on that site along the banks of the Trinity River, which was originally located on the site. In some ways, too, the larger project restitches the site of the displaced river. The river once existed right here, and it was moved a half mile away after flooding downtown. And so really even reconnecting that part of the site's history took the form here of a series of extended forest plantings, pedestrian pathways, bike pathways, and so that Dealey Plaza in the foot of downtown would be finally reconnected to the river that was moved away, right? And so this project wasn't about commemorating one moment in time or freezing one moment in time. It was a project that was very much interested in allowing the multiple histories, the multiple informants of what that site had been and is to begin to be known, to be present, and to begin to continue to play themselves out over time. So I think I'm going to wrap there simply by saying in many of this, we're clearly attempting to draw on the people, the cultures, the traditions, the ecologies, and the technologies that are already in play in certain places to identify the ways in which we can both respond to and shift what's at work on sites, and to do it through our own tools and training and ideologies as designers with cultural ambition and a cultural agenda of our own. Often this includes revealing what is hidden, recognizing difference, developing open space strategies that encourage or spark adaptation and appropriation, giving voice to people and creatures and forces that have been muted, amplifying environmental and ecological dynamics, and making impact and catalyzing change through design. So in that sense, it's Design Publics maintains the idea of design as a project, as a critique, as a part of the larger political, ideological, and intellectual discourse. And yet it also maintains that the world, or more precisely what matters in the world, what's at stake in society today, can inform both the design and matter of an ideology of a project, whether that's social, cultural, environmental, or political. Design with and for and behalf of the common people and places and creatures and issues and interests that contribute to and enrich a collective and community welfare, a broader civic and environmental purpose. Thanks. Happy to take a few questions. I know that was a lot. What do you got? Don't be shy. Yeah.
So I love the projects where you're talking about designing the spaces for the animal cities first. I'm wondering how the success that you've seen for some of like the bird habitats and how they then interact with people who are using that site also.
Yeah, so obviously a lot of the projects I was showing when we were talking about wildlife were speculative projects right now. I mean, it's easy to begin to think about the ways in which we can design for urban wildlife within bigger parks within the city. We have to be careful when we talk with clients about that because, you know, some wildlife is nice, songbirds, but if you start talking about other kinds of creatures that might inhabit those spaces, people get really nervous, right? So in some ways, it's not for the everyday park that the school work is being thought of. It's really to think about places like Los Angeles, where you have these very dramatic interfaces between wildlands and where urban development is happening, right? So how do you begin to kind of reconsider the way some of those edges and some of those places are considered? They're dealing with wildlife every day anyway. There was a moment where I was listening to the radio in LA, and you got the weather report, you got the traffic report, and then you had the report on P22, which was the mountain lion that was wandering around the city, right? Which was kind of cool on the one hand, but it was also kind of putting front and center this idea that really there's wildlife roaming the city, right? So how do we design for that? How do we design with that is a big question. And I think in some ways it's the same thing as some of the climate and environmental adaptation things that we're dealing with, right? The rising seawater is not going to go away, right? So you have to confront it. You have to say, yes, there's going to be flooding. How do we deal with it, right? And I think the first step is to say, yeah, there's something here going on. Let's recognize that. And then let's figure out design solutions that might better accommodate some of those things, allowing those different ways of thinking. I mean, the whole idea of living with water and living with flooding in very deliberate ways is an idea that's emerged really within the last 20 years, I'd say, within Western cultures, right? And it's in some ways it points the way toward conversations that they're having in LA and other places right now about how do we live with wildfire, right? How do we accept that it's going to happen, right? And how do we build cities, houses, urban developments to better deal with the fact that there's a reality out there. So I think this is just a kind of extension of that. And it's a speculative extension of that. What else? Yeah, Amy.
So on the Dallas project, you called it sort of self-initiated by Mark Lamster.
Yep.
Have you, or how do you envision it sort of continuing forward in terms of actually happening and solving that sort of conundrum?
Yeah, so the first step was the newspaper. I mean, it's not often you get a newspaper critic saying, we're going to put you on the front page of the Sunday morning paper and then give you most of the arts and leisure section to kind of play this out. And of course, Mark wrote a beautiful piece for this. We then set up a couple of public forums to have conversation about it and to begin a dialogue about that, right? And I think what we found was some people are actually really quite sensitive. There's still a bit of shame around the fact that a president was shot there. So talking about it is hard, right? So I acknowledge that. And so some people still want the thing frozen in time and just want to say, okay, well, if we don't do anything, we don't have to talk about it, right? But in some ways, you know, the first step to healing is being able to have conversations about these things, right? And so it started a conversation. We even took it, we started to refine some of the drawings in response to things that were important. I mean, at the top of the grassy knoll was this old wooden fence that we thought was just this like odd remnant. Well, it turns out in people's mind, the wooden fence was there the day that Kennedy was shot, and behind it's just a parking lot. And so instead of having a plaza back there and taking the fence away, we very quickly realized it was really, really important to keep some of these things that were part of the kind of built-in cultural history of the place, right? And we could begin to adapt certain pieces for that. So we had a couple of conversations about that. We even talked to a couple potential funders or people who might lead a project like that. We've kind of let the thing quiet down for a little bit, but we just presented the work at the Chicago Architecture Biennale this past weekend, and it too has started to get a few more people thinking about, well, you know, is there a moment in time that's right to have this conversation? On the one hand, we want to enhance the experience of people and frankly, make sure that they're not run over by cars as they're trying to kind of make their way around. We want Martyrs Park to be part of the real experience, not something you have to find by dodging cars and trains and all those other things, right? So there really is an opportunity to have a more thoughtful conversation about that entire part of the city. So its time may come at some point. It's just a slow process. Yeah.
I was very interested by the talk, thank you. I have two questions.
Yeah.
I'm currently writing a history of the sandbox, and one of the first episodes happened in Charles Bank Park, and that I'm not sure exists this way anymore. It was part of the Emerald Necklace of Olmsted, and I was wondering if it's part of the area where your design is.
No, I think that's on the Charles River, Charles Bank, and we're on the ocean front. It's interesting though, because there was an entire riverside series of parks that were built and then were unbuilt and a road was put in, and then new parks, they actually just pushed out into the water and built a series of new parks along there. So it's really in that stretch of the river. But you're literally talking about sandboxes. Yeah.
Because the reason that was interesting to me is because Charles Bank held the first ever sandbox in Founding Park. Also run by women. There was a pavilion next to it. So that was interesting to me. What's happening with that area? That's one question. The other, more general question: sand. Does sand have at all a place in design of parks, of spaces? Also, for my research, it's been banned.
Yeah. I mean, for a while, it was like public health issues and playgrounds and, you know, what are people sticking into sand and all those sorts of things.
I mean, is there room for sand other than the construction site?
Yeah. We're quite fascinated by that in the coastal park of Moakley Park. And in fact, there was one image from the ground that has an implication of sandy dunes. And we keep sort of putting that out there, and then quietly, the city gets nervous when you do that or talk about things that might move. You know, I mean, one of the issues with sand is it moves around and blows and all those sorts of things, right? So if you're not actually on a beachfront and not actually doing things like dune restoration or interacting with the dunes, it's hard to have those conversations because people start to get nervous. It is one of those materials, though, that's really quite fascinating because it moves with wind, it moves with water, right? But there are ways in which you can design with plant material and with other material to kind of play with that movement a lot. I think probably people are more comfortable dealing with that, not in the most urban or developed places, but just on the edges, right? There may be opportunities to think about that a little bit more. There's a woman at Harvard that I teach with, Karen Lee Bar-Sinai, I think is her name. And she's been doing, looking at robotics, and she's been using sand as a medium for looking at the way in which programming software to instruct robots how to move things around in response to certain environmental patterns and conditions. I think there's something going on there with that I think is quite fascinating. I've just started a conversation with her about that. It's leading edge work, so it's not ready to be implemented in something, but I think it is really fascinating and would maybe be interesting for you to look at.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else? Yeah.
How long ago was that mounting project you did, and is it still there?
No, so it was a temporary project. It was probably about 15 years ago. And I got a call from the dean at the time. He said, Chris, come here. I need you to come over to Radcliffe. The dean of Radcliffe has a thing. And I'm like, oh, she wants us to design the quad or something. And we went over, met on site, and she said, look, this site here was a construction laydown space for that building over there, right? And it's going to be a construction layout space when we start the next building over there. But this weekend, or this coming weekend, we have this big alumni, 150, whatever. And so it can't look like this. What can you do? And I was like, I don't know. And that was a Friday, and by Monday, we had sent her a design. The other thing she told us was, I love Zen gardens, which to us is like, people don't know how to say with landscape, I like contemporary landscape. I like contemporary design. And so when somebody says to me, I like Zen gardens, what they usually saying is, I like something that feels contemporary and isn't just romantic and old school, and it's not formal gardens and those sorts of things. So I said, oh, I have this idea about stone and some plant material. A couple of those mounds had ferns on it. And so she instantly bought the idea, right? And then we were trying to find the most interesting aggregates to pile up. The funniest part, though, is the people who installed it, like they decided, I thought they would just come in and dump a pile and then it would just be the pile, right? They wanted to get these things precise. And so the workers were amazing. Like they were in there, they were trimming it, right? And so I think it went in the fall, and then all sorts of things happened. It snowed, the squirrels started to erode. And I was taking pictures, right? And I came back in the spring, and all of a sudden everything was trim again. And I called somebody. I said, "What happened?" Like, well, they came back and they didn't like that it was all pockmarked, and so they trimmed it all back up. I said, "Stop! Tell them to stop doing that, right?" Like, the whole idea is that they wear away, and of course, the ones that had big rubble didn't move, right? But there was one with crushed concrete, which had different size aggregates to it. And so some of the smaller aggregates would fall away, and you'd see the differentiation in aggregates. So it was really a kind of lovely essay. But then, yeah, it went away. The nice part was it became a garden where there's an annual or biannual contest for students to propose an installation in that garden. And I think I sat on the first 5 years of jury for that. So it is a place, it's very public, it's at Radcliffe's yard. So now students can actually make proposals there, which is kind of cool. All right, thanks everybody, appreciate it.